Last time, we learned the story of the Mary Celeste, a ship with a dark history, a ship that had lost her first captain to illness before her maiden voyage was even complete, that had been involved in collisions, that had run aground, that had changed hands and changed names and finally came to rest under the command of a man named Benjamin Briggs in the autumn of 1872. We learned about the people who sailed on her. Captain Briggs, 37 years old, experienced, careful, devout, a man who chose his crew on the basis of character as much as skill. His wife Sarah, 30 years old, who loved the sea, who played the Melodeon, who brought her instrument with her on the voyage because music was part of who she was. Their daughter Sophia, 2 years old, too young to understand where she was going, young enough that her world was entirely her parents'. She went where they went. 7 crew members, all described as peaceable men, first-class sailors, men with families waiting for them, men who expected to return. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste sailed out of New York Harbor into the Atlantic and was never heard from again. The last log entry was dated November 25th. The ship was found on December 4th. 10 people gone. This is episode 2. This is what those last days looked like. I want to tell you about the morning of November 7th, 1872, because it matters, because it was the last ordinary morning those 10 people ever had. Captain Briggs was on deck early. He was always on deck early, the kind of man who did not sleep late when there was work to be done. And on a departure morning, there was always work to be done. Final checks of the rigging, final confirmation of the cargo, final review of the charts and the route and the provisions. The cargo was 1,701 barrels of crude industrial alcohol, loaded carefully over the preceding weeks under Briggs's personal supervision. The barrels were stowed in the hold, secured against the movement of the ship at sea, checked and rechecked. The provisions were 6 months of food and water, far more than the voyage to Genoa required. The Atlantic crossing typically took 3 to 4 weeks in good conditions. 6 months of provisions was extraordinary caution, the kind of caution that characterized everything Briggs did. Sarah Briggs was below with Sophia, getting the child settled, making the small domestic arrangements that transform a ship's cabin into something that can be called home for the weeks of a crossing. Her sewing things in their place, the Melodeon secured against rough weather, Sophia's toys arranged where the child could reach them. The 7 crew members were at their stations, checking lines, checking sails, the work of preparing a ship to leave harbor. At some point in the morning, Briggs wrote the final few lines of a letter to his mother. He had started it days before. He finished it now and posted it before departure. He wrote, "I write a hasty line to say that we are about to leave New York, and I hope we shall have a pleasant passage. We have had rainy weather the last few days, and I hope we shall have better soon." He added, "We seem to have a very good crew, and I have the best of confidence in them." He signed the letter, sealed it, and went up to deck to take his ship out of the harbor. That was the last letter Benjamin Briggs ever wrote, the last words anyone outside that ship ever received from any of the 10 people aboard. "We seem to have a very good crew, and I have the best of confidence in them." Words that sound like the beginning of something, words that were the end. The first week of the voyage was reasonable. The weather in the western Atlantic in early November can be manageable. Cold, often gray, but manageable. The Mary Celeste made good progress in the first days out of New York, moving east and south toward the Azores, the standard route for a ship bound for the Mediterranean. Briggs made his log entries carefully, as he always did, noting position, wind direction, sea state, barometric pressure, the ordinary daily record of a working ship on a working voyage. The entries are precise, professional. They reveal nothing unusual. Day 1, position, wind from the northwest, making good speed, crew in good order. Day 3, weather turning, wind increasing, Taking on some water over the bow in heavy seas, but nothing concerning. Day 7. Storm conditions. Significant wave height. Ship performing well. All hands working. Day 10. Weather easing. Position calculated. On course. Nothing in these entries hints at what was coming. Nothing suggests that the man writing them had any reason to believe this voyage would be different from the dozens of Atlantic crossings he had made before. But the weather was getting worse. November in the North Atlantic is notoriously difficult. The storms that move across it in November are the storms that have shaped the fear of the sea in every maritime culture that has ever existed. Deep cold systems, high waves, sustained winds that can push a laden vessel off course and hold her there for days. The Mary Celeste was a good ship, well maintained, well crewed, but she was 100 feet long and 282 tons, and the North Atlantic in November does not care about any of that. The log entries from the second and third weeks of the voyage show deteriorating conditions, heavy weather, strong winds, high seas. Still nothing alarming in the entries themselves. Briggs was not a man who expressed alarm easily. He was the kind of man who wrote down facts and kept his feelings to himself. But the facts he was writing down were the facts of a ship fighting through difficult conditions day after day. And there was something else. Something the log does not mention directly. Something that would only be understood weeks later when the ship was found and men went below and looked at the cargo. 9 of the 1701 barrels of industrial alcohol were empty, not broken, not leaking in any obvious way. Just empty. And the alcohol that had been in them had gone somewhere, into the air of the hold, building up in the darkness below the deck, invisible, odorless in small quantities, but in the quantity that 1701 barrels could produce, potentially explosive, potentially terrifying to a careful man who understood what he was carrying, potentially the beginning of everything that followed. I want to tell you about Sarah Briggs, because she is the person in this story I find myself thinking about most, not because her story is more important than the others. All of them matter, all 10 of them, but because of what we know about her, because of the letters she wrote. Sarah Briggs was a remarkable woman by any measure of her time. She was educated. She was musical. She was capable of managing a household on land and comfortable managing one on a ship at sea. She had sailed with her husband before. She knew what an ocean crossing meant. The isolation, the confinement, the long gray days of open water with nothing visible in any direction. She chose to be there. That matters. She could have stayed in Massachusetts with her mother, with Arthur, her older son, in comfort and safety. She chose to go. In a letter to her mother-in-law written before departure, she described the crew as quietly capable. She described the ship as well provided. She sounded like a woman who had assessed her situation and found it acceptable. She had brought the Melodeon because music was her way of filling the long hours at sea. She played it in the evenings, after Sophia was asleep, after the day's work was done. I think about those evenings, the small cabin, the lamp burning, the sound of the Melodeon against the sound of the sea outside the hull. Sophia sleeping, Briggs perhaps writing in his log or reading, the crew on their watches above. Ordinary life, ordinary evenings, the small domestic warmth that humans carry with them wherever they go, even into the middle of the Atlantic in November, even onto a ship that history had already decided was cursed. She had no way of knowing that. She had no way of knowing that the Melodeon she played in those evenings would still be in the cabin weeks later, still in its place. When men from another ship came aboard and found everything exactly as she had left it, except for her, except for Briggs, except for Sophia and the 7 men who had sailed with them, all of them simply gone. The last log entry was made at 5 in the morning on November 25, 1872. Position, wind, sea state. The Mary Celeste within sight of the Azores island of Santa Maria. Nothing alarming in the entry. Nothing to suggest that this would be the last entry. After that, 9 days of silence, 9 days in which the Mary Celeste continued moving, east and then north, carried by the winds and currents of the Atlantic, with no one at the wheel, no one making log entries, no one recording what was happening. 9 days in which 10 people disappeared from a ship in the middle of the ocean and were never seen again. What happened in those 9 days? That is the question that has never been answered. We know some things. We know the lifeboat was missing. We know the ship's navigational instruments were missing. The sextant, the chronometer, the things a captain takes with him when he expects to navigate from a small boat. We know the ship's papers were missing. The official documents, the things a captain needs to identify himself and his crew. These things suggest a deliberate departure, not a panic, not an explosion that scattered people into the sea. A deliberate decision to leave the ship. Someone made a decision. At some point in those 9 days after November 25th, Captain Briggs made a decision that experienced captains almost never make. He decided to abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship and take his wife and his 2-year-old daughter and 7 crew members into a lifeboat in the North Atlantic in November. The question that has tortured historians and investigators for 150 years is, why? What could he possibly have seen or heard or believed that made abandoning a good ship seem like the right thing to do? What made the ship seem more dangerous than the open ocean in a small lifeboat in November? We do not know. We may never know, but we can look at what was there, at what the men who boarded her found, at the clues the ship left behind, and we can try to understand. That is what episode 3 will try to do. What the men from the Dei Grazia found when they boarded the Mary Celeste, what the evidence told them, and what it did not tell them. This is episode 2 of the Mary Celeste. Subscribe to Grey Archive Tales and come back. We will be waiting. Before I finish this episode, I want to tell you one more thing about Edward Head, the ship's cook and steward, 23 years old. He was the youngest member of the crew. He had only recently married. His wife was waiting for him in New York. He had told her he would be back before Christmas. He had never made an Atlantic crossing before. This was his first voyage of this kind. He was young, new to this work, new to marriage, new to the particular kind of hope that comes with being young and at the beginning of your life. He took this job because the pay was good, because he wanted to prove himself, because a young man in 1872 did not turn down the opportunity to sail on a well-regarded ship under a respected captain. His wife's name was Emma. We know this from the ship's records, from the documents filed before departure. Emma Head. She waited for her husband through December, through Christmas, through the new year of 1873. The news of the Mary Celeste reached New York before Edward Head did. He never came back. Emma Head was 21 years old when her husband sailed out of New York Harbor on November 7, 1872. She was a widow before the year was out, without ever knowing why, without ever knowing what happened, without ever finding anything to bury or to mourn over except the absence itself. I think about Emma Head the way I think about Conrad watching Frau Sophia dance. The way grief attaches itself to ordinary people and makes them extraordinary simply by what they are asked to endure. She deserved better than that. They all deserved better. This is episode 2 of the Mary Celeste, the story of the last ordinary days of 10 people who sailed into history and did not come back. Subscribe to Grey Archive Tales and come back. We will be waiting.